Hi, good evening. Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to be here. So, as Deb introduced me, my name is Kurt Shaw. I grew up until I was about 10 here in Denver, but since I was 20 or so, I've spent most of my life in Latin America, first in Colombia, Central America, and now for the last 25 years in Brazil. And tonight, what I really want to talk about is today in Brazil and the situation of polarization, of political polarization that we live in the United States is not very different from what's going on in Brazil. But perhaps by trying to understand what's going on in this neighbor in the Southern Hemisphere, we can also understand a little bit about what's going on here. A lot of this work has emerged from a research project that the co-director of the NGO that I run and I, Rita da Silva, have been doing for the last 3 years directly, but for the last 10 years more broadly. To talk a little bit about Brazil, probably when many people think about Brazil, they think about the Amazon, they think about samba, they think about football. All things that are legitimate and true. But what I want to talk about to begin is to insist that Brazil is an immensely diverse country. From indigenous people in the north, one of the largest enslaved African populations anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Also European migration that begins, of course, with Portuguese, but also Italians, Germans, Ukrainians. And so it's an immensely diverse country. And perhaps equally important, and this is something that many people don't know about Brazil, is that Brazil conceives of itself as really as an actor on the world stage. It sees itself as a big, important country. Brazil invests a lot in foreign relations. Brazil puts a lot of effort into the United Nations, into peacekeeping missions, and really understands itself as a protagonist on the world stage. It does not see itself as a small country, as subordinate. When Deb began, she talked about spheres of influence. Brazil would not see itself as part of the sphere of influence of the United States or anybody else. And I think that's really important to understand as we start talking here. Brazil also has the reputation of being a very cordial country, a hospitable country. If any of you who have been there, certainly you've had the experience of people receiving very well this enthusiasm to know other people. And the great Brazilian sociologist Sergio Buarque de Holanda declared that Brazil was the home of the cordial man. There's a complicated story behind that, which I'll get into later. At the same time, we're dealing with a country where the violence of political polarization has become very extreme, where the rhetoric and the consequences of that have happened. And so one of the things that I want to try to deal with is thinking about this contradiction between this wonderfully open, welcoming, hospitable country and the level of political rage and anger that we see today. And I'm going to start this whole talk in a place that might not seem really usual for this sort of talk here at the World Affairs Council. I'm going to start with slavery. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw slavery, 1888, so about 25 years after the United States did. And it's very important to understand how slavery functions to be able to understand how we've gotten to the political point that we have in Brazil today. As a general rule, when we think about slavery, whether we're reading books, whether we're watching movies, you imagine this relationship between the slaver and the slave, right? Even Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's dialectic of the master and slave is just those two figures. But the truth of the matter is that most of the relationships that enslaved people had in their daily lives were with a different middle level of people, of slave breakers, overseers, free whites, free blacks. And that middle section is really important to understanding everything else that's going on here. Because the relationship, the way that slavery worked in Brazil, and I think there's a pretty good argument that did in the United States as well, was about humiliation. So yes, slavery is about the whip. Slavery is about the fear of death. But slavery is really about killing the dignity in people. So when the function of slavery is that you've got an elite, and the elite is able to humiliate everybody. They're allowed to take anybody's dignity away. Then there is a middle group, which is which is submitted to humiliation by the elite, but can also humiliate the lower part, the lowest part of the group. And their sense of self and place in the world is based upon that. So Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, as I said. But when I first came to Brazil in 2001, slavery really continued to exist. As domestic servants, there would be in upper and upper middle class homes, there would be families, there would be a servant who would live in, who would probably receive food and a bed and maybe a little bit of money, but not necessarily labor benefits, certainly not any of the things that we would expect as salary. In 2002, that changed. But Brazil does, in spite of formally abolishing slavery in 1888, it really continued in many ways. And that has also a lot to do with what I want to talk about. So let's move on to modernity. 2002, the Workers' Party wins the federal election in Brazil. And it has decided really to pull Brazil into a world of the modern economy and of human rights. There's a lot of consequences to that. One is that in this way that slavery had continued, it cannot anymore. Domestic servants have to receive benefits, real salary, a minimum wage. They have to have time off. They have to have their Christmas bonus, all of those sorts of things. That's also true in the labor relations that happen in factories, in small businesses. Very important changes, bringing Brazil into a different moment in history. The second thing that happened is that you have the attempt to democratize the benefits of the state. I was talking to Seamus before about the Brazilian educational system. When I first went there, the woman who would become my wife was teaching anthropology at the public university, and I was just so excited about this public university. It had great teachers, really nice campuses, great programs. I mean, it was really a point of access to the managerial middle class. And then began to realize that in order to get into these free public universities, the only way that you would qualify to pass the university entrance exams was having 12 years in really expensive elite private schools. So what you had is this sort of utopian scheme, but it was considered to be a privilege of the elite. When the Workers' Party comes in, they first of all expand the public university system 3 times. I mean, it's a big, big change in that. But they also say that half of all places have to be for public school students, and 10% have to be for indigenous and black students. And so you have this change in the democratization of the access to the goods of the state. Same thing happens in civil service exams, the same thing happens in public procurement. The result of this, as well as other economic policies like Bolsa Familia, which is a welfare policy which is given to the mothers of families, given very explicitly to mothers and not fathers. And we did a research project in about 2011 about the consequence of Bolsa Familia in the favelas of Recife, the slums, the most unequal city in Brazil, one of the poorest cities in Brazil, and found that in general, a lot of the money from the welfare benefit would be used for food, for gas, for cooking and things like that, for buying a new appliance. But a small percentage, might have just been $20 a month, but it was sufficient to start saving money and have the capital for new businesses, which might just be starting off selling ice from your freezer, and then use the money from that to sell popsicles, and then use the money that you earned from that to buy another refrigerator and sell juice that your cousin was able to send the fruit from the interior. And so over the course of about 2006 to 2011, the income in the favelas doubled. I mean, an amazing, amazing transformation. And with that, you also see the access of traditionally poor people from favelas, from the interior of the country, to be able to fly on airplanes, to be able to dress well, to have the access to the goods of prestige. And then finally, the other change that happens with the power of the Workers' Party in 2002 is that there's a sort of Brazilian version of political correctness or wokeness. Particularly prohibitions on racist language and homophobic and sexist language. and this is going to be important later on that I'll talk about, Brazil doesn't have the same free speech fundamentalism that the United States does. They see that the Brazilian Constitution sees that words can be weapons, and in the same way that if somebody hits you with a stick, you should be penalized, that if you hit somebody with words that are really harming that person, you should also be penalized. But that's going to be important to think about later. So this gives a certain context of Brazil from very, very superficially, from times of very recent slavery through this attempt to drag Brazil into modernity in the 21st century. But what does this have to say about contemporary Brazilian politics and polarization? So the first thing I want to talk about is the loss of privilege. A lot of social science shows that people feel a lot more angry when they lose something that they've got than when they don't get something that they want. And so this dynamic of loss and the sense that you might be losing your privileges is important. So the upper middle class and the upper class continue to be able to fly on airplanes in Brazil. They continue to go to public universities. They continue to have nice clothes. But at the moment that poor people also have access to those goods, then suddenly it's no longer a prestige good. It's just something that anybody can have. And so they're not really losing anything, but they are losing their prestige. They're losing this as a privilege. And so the moment that this movement to modernity, where you try to see the benefits of the state as rights and not as privileges, this is understood by a certain percentage of the elite to be a threat to their position in society. There's a really fascinating story in the 19th century in Brazil which sort of illustrates this. It was a similar time in the 1850s where you have because of international trade, the emperor of Portugal had moved to Brazil, and so you have a middle management of government and commerce. And so there's a new upper middle class that emerges. Some of them of mixed race, some of the new immigrants. And with their money, they start to ride in European carriages, wear silk shirts, use fashion, and the traditional upper class, especially young men in the traditional upper class, were furious. There are these fashion mobs, fashion lynching, where they go around and they start attacking, where upper class elite youth start going and killing young men who were wearing fashionable clothes because they weren't allowed to. Slaves were not allowed to wear shoes, for instance. Blacks were not allowed to wear shoes. And so the idea that somebody else who was not part of this traditional elite would be wearing silk was horrible. It's not that they didn't get to wear silk anymore, but that silk, when other people were wearing it, didn't mean the same thing. And so there's a similar process that goes on. In Brazilian architecture, Brazilian middle-class architecture is interesting, that when you go into an apartment building, there are always two elevators. There is the social elevator, which is for the people who live there and their friends, and then there's the service elevator, which is for the staff. And when we were making a movie in Recife about 10 years ago, one of the young men who was a camera assistant on the movie, but from the favelas, young, black, really handsome, charismatic, great. But he was in the social elevator because he was a guest of the people who were making the movie. And you wouldn't believe the fury of some of the people what, there's a black guy? He's from the favela and he's in the social elevator? They continue to get to use the social elevator. But it's not the same social elevator if somebody else gets to use it. And so this situation of you're not really losing the thing itself, but you're losing it as a privilege. And this is really important to understand that what will become an elite opposition to progressive policies in Brazil and an increase in anger and polarization. There's an interesting inverse to this, which is happening in Argentina right now, just sort of as an aside. So I don't know if any of you pay any attention to Argentine politics, but the president is now Javier Milei, who's this right-wing libertarian who's trying to eliminate any benefits that the state provides of labor benefits, social welfare, social security, for instance. And there was an interview with a young man that went viral in Argentina, where somebody asked him, well, why would you vote for Milei when he's taking away all of your benefits? And he said, I've never had these benefits, but at least you don't have them either. And so that's the inverse story. It is it's the question of distribution distribution of goods by the state, and what does that mean? What does that mean for who I am, how I am recognized? I'm a philosopher by training, and so just to say briefly that the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche defined all of this as ressentiment, resentment, which is not just that I resent, that I want what you have. Envy is that I see what you've got and I want it, but ressentiment is you've got something really great, I can't get it, and so I want to make sure that you can't get it. And so there is, I think all of us have experienced that in certain ways. Nietzsche says that it's something that's very important in European psychology. But that concept of resentment is going to come back time and time again. So I want to go back now to because I think that's a very good way of thinking about why certain parts of the Brazilian elite have gone radically toward the political right, and especially an angry political right. Now I want to go back to this question of humiliation that we talked about, or that I talked about, which is within slavery, how the elite can humiliate everybody, but there's this middle group, which during slave periods was slave breakers, poor whites, overseers, etc. And they could humiliate people underneath them as well. Anybody who's been part of a bureaucracy probably knows about you kiss up and you kick down, right? And so what happens with this new political correctness, the prohibition of racism, prohibition of homophobia, is that all of those little ways that you could kick down and you could feel as if you were above somebody else, racist jokes, homophobic jokes, those sort of looks, treatment of women in certain ways, you don't get to do it anymore. You will continue to be humiliated by the elite if you're in that middle frame, but you don't get to humiliate anybody else. And so the place that you are in, you've lost it. You've suddenly been denigrated to the lowest level of society. And when somebody like Jair Bolsonaro, who won the presidency in 2018, comes in and starts not only making those jokes, but also giving everybody permission to make those jokes again, then suddenly, oh, I feel free. I feel like I have the power that I had again. So that dynamic is really important to understand how Brazilian polarization is happening these days. So that, I think, talks a little bit about how the legacy of slavery has contributed to contemporary Brazilian polarization. But I also want to talk about how the legacy of colonialism, which is to say the genocide of the indigenous people and the takeover of the land has also contributed to it. So the history of colonial Brazil can really be understood to a certain degree as an attempt to transform land into property. So within European ideas of property, whether you're talking about John Locke or Roman law, what makes land property, what makes it yours, is if you work it. If you transform it, if you turn it from, you cut down the trees and you make it a farm. You cut down the trees and you sell them. And that's what's making land into something, into property. And because the Portuguese, when they arrived, believed that they were just coming onto this place that was savage, that was wild, there was no property, then that was what they were sent to do, was to transform it into property. Now, first of all, that's completely and utterly wrong. I've spent a lot of time in the Amazon now, working with indigenous groups, and it's really interesting to see the way that they understand the need to cultivate land. Now, when I say cultivate land, I don't mean that they are growing crops on the land. I'm saying that they are growing the land. That the Amazon itself is really, really bad land. It's sand, effectively, with a little bit of humus on top from many years of leaves. And so the indigenous people spent years, decades, centuries working on composting, on integrating the ash from their fires with broken up ceramics, with all the food that had been left over, with leaves that would be brought in. I mean, it's an amazing process of composting to create what's called teja preta. And today, when we talk about the Amazon as rich land, and when there's an attempt to move into the Amazon as farms and so forth, what are they doing is they are being parasitic on thousands of years of work of the indigenous people in cultivating land. So the idea that the Europeans had, that they were just coming into a wild place, is in fact wrong. There are lots of indigenous people who I talk to who insist, for you, this jungle seems to be wild and uncontrollable and savage. For us, it's a garden. We have been participating, we've been planting, we've been helping this garden. We have been planting this, and it has been planting us for the last 2,000 years. Nonetheless, this idea of transforming land, or what they perceived as virgin land, into property, has continued throughout Brazil. And during the military dictatorship from 64 until 88, this became really extreme. I don't know if any of you have seen the Secret Agent, which is up for the Oscar this year. There are many other Brazilian movies that are about the dictatorship, but they're almost always about the disappearance, forced murder, torture, and so forth of urban intellectual radicals, which was, in fact, a huge problem. But the greatest number of people who were killed, disappeared, executed, tortured by the Brazilian dictatorship were indigenous people in the Amazon. Why? Because of this desire to transform, take their land, effectively. After democratization in 1988, we have a period where things get better for a while. But again, in 2016, and then especially in 2018, when Bolsonaro wins the presidential election, the federal government decides to look the other way. The paradigmatic case in these times is the Yanomami indigenous people in the very north of Brazil, who live in a land where there is a lot of gold. And so for many, many years, the government had been working on making sure that the wildcat miners couldn't get in. 2016, they stopped looking that way. And there are 5,000 wildcat miners that invade. And within several years, in 2022, we did an interview with a Yanomami woman, and it was just tragic. I spent the whole time crying as she was explaining that her whole family was poisoned by mercury, that all of the game was gone, all of the fruit was gone. They all had to leave their land. There were thousands of Yanomamis who were dying in this case. Basically, in order to continue this idea that land has to be proper, that land has to be productive, and indigenous people do not make it productive. Bringing this back to questions of polarization, there were two campaign slogans that Bolsonaro had. One which was, not one more square centimeter of land for the Indians, and the second was, so much land for so few Indians. And so this anger, and I'm going to return to the idea of resentment of indigenous people as having way too much land, much more than they deserve, was something that really animated who they were, who this new right was. Then, finally, we have to say that all of this happens within the context of online life and social media. There are very few countries that are online as much as Brazilians are. We don't use phones anymore. We only use WhatsApp. Everybody is on Instagram. I mean, it's a very online country. And the results of that, like we have in the United States, are these bubbles where you can find somebody in any place on the other side of the world who thinks like you do, and you don't pay any attention to your neighbor anymore. In addition to that, you have the death of public space in Brazil. There's a time when there's a lot of fear of crime, where people spend less time on the street. We did a movie in Brasilia last year where a group of kids we asked them just to dream about what kind of a day that they would love. And the day that they wanted was the internet to break. For some of them, it was that the internet was going to break because there were aliens invading, there was an earthquake, there was a power outage, whatever it was. The internet was going to break, and their parents would accept that they shouldn't be on their cell phones and they should go out in the street and play. But the way that because of the fear of the street and because of the seductive power of digital media and these stupid cell phones that we have, that kids aren't on the street anymore. And so that place of encounter, of knowing people who are really different than you are, is gone. So these are lots of negative things. I was here at the talk last week, 2 weeks ago, on nuclear proliferation, and everybody left saying, "Oh my word, I'm glad I knew that, but I really wish I didn't know that." And I don't want to conclude that way. I want to talk about some points of hope in Brazil. And lessons that it might teach. And one thing that I think is really important to begin with is to say that conflict isn't bad. Polarization, in the sense of not being able to talk to somebody who doesn't agree with me, that's bad. But having conflict is actually really good. One of the things that Sergio Buarque de Holanda says about the cordial man is that you are cordial so that you actually don't talk about conflict, so that you don't deal with the fact that Brazil is a really unjust country with interests that are very different. I mean, in a country that has as great a difference between rich and poor, rural and urban, north and south, northeast and southwest as Brazil does, conflicts are there. Conflicts are good. We should have them out. We just need to be able to talk about them. And so I do want to put that on the ground. The question is not that we're trying to find some perfect intermediate harmony that everybody can live. No, we're trying to understand that there are conflicts, but we need to resolve them in ways that are nonviolent. And I think actually Brazil has some things really important to say about that. The first thing I want to talk about is a very political science, which is that the Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes has said, and I think really brilliantly, that the difference between the United States and Brazil is that because Brazil just emerged from the dictatorship 40 years ago, and because the Constitution of Brazil was written against the dictatorship, Brazil has the antibodies against authoritarianism. Brazil has the memory of what it was, and they don't want to fall back into that. And so, for instance, what happened in Brazil in January 8th, 2023 was almost the same thing as what happened in Washington on January 6th, 2011. Bolsonaro organized his supporters to go and take over the Capitol, the Supreme Court, try to destroy it. Their plan was that they were going to create a state of emergency. The military would step in and reinstall Bolsonaro. In Brazil, because of the protagonism of the Supreme Court on questions of democracy, and because you don't have to go through all of these levels of appeals on cases that are this important, Jair Bolsonaro is in jail. In the United States, that didn't happen. And there are also many other people who were involved in that. But I think even more importantly is because of that trial, which was a huge thing in Brazil. It was televised nationally, it was constantly on TV. You created a world of facts. Even Bolsonaro supporters agree that he did something wrong, agree that he should be in jail. There was an attempt by his sons to create laws for pardon of having Bolsonaro just absolved of his criminality. That had almost no support, even among his supporters, even among the far right. The debate now is much more about, well, is his cell big enough? Does he deserve this sort of treatment? Can we reduce his crime, his penalty? But the actual fact is there. So I think that institutional part of Brazil really worked in a way that the great democracy of the world, the United States, didn't. Another thing that I think is really important, and a lesson that Brazil has for dealing with these questions of polarization and how we can talk to each other, comes from indigenous thought. So, first of all, Brazil, even though there are only about 2% of the population which declare themselves to be indigenous, the country is really informed by Native American thought. For instance, in Portuguese, if you say, we are going to the store, we are going to the beach, it's a gente vai pra. The people are going to. The reason that you say the people are going to instead of we are going to, that's because it's an indigenous construction. Tupi-Guarani works that way, Baniwa works that way, Arawaki works that way, Tucano works that way. So, and the number of words from indigenous languages in Brazilian Portuguese is immense. The grammatical structure, the way that the ow sound at the end of the words is made, different from Portugal, it's all because of the influence of indigenous people. In the 18th century, the official language of Brazil was Nhangatu, which is a Guarani dialect. So in spite of the fact that there are not that many Brazilian people, there are not that many indigenous people who are in Brazil, indigenous ideas are really important. And perhaps the most important indigenous idea that comes out of the Amazon, and one that's inspired me constantly since I've learned about it, working with indigenous communities, especially on the upper Rio Negro, which is close to Venezuela and Colombia, is the idea that our both ethical and epistemological duty, our moral duty and our duty to know the world, is to see the world through the eyes of the other, to feel the world through the feet of this on the sand of the other. It's not just that Jesus' commandment to walk in the shoes of the other person, but really to see through the eyes of the jaguar. That's what shamanism is about. It's the attempt. Why do you the word in Arawete for my enemy is future song. Why? Because you want the enemy to be different from you so that he will invent a new song. You can go and take that song, and when you start to sing that song, you know new things. Your mouth moves in new ways. Your perspective on the world is transformed. We did a movie for public TV about the Dabukuri festival, which is all about these encounters. And the shaman, who is one of the most important interviewees of the movie, says, when the great spirits, male and female, brought us up the Amazon on the snake boat, each one of us would be dropped off in a different place along the Amazon. And he would give to each group its dances and its songs so that they could live in happiness and joy. And then that we would come back together in the Dabukuri festival to share what we had learned and learn the dances of the others as they had changed. Now, this is not to say that it's all perfect. They also fought wars. They also stole from each other. But the basic premise is that you want to see through the eyes of the other. And this is something that actually does work very well in Brazil. And it's, I think, something that we can see in the Brazilian theater tradition. It's not coincidence that the international films for the last 3 years that have been nominated for Emmys, for Oscars, have been Brazilian. Brazilian acting, Brazilian films are extraordinary, and it's largely because of this duty to incorporate in the body of the other. And I think that really provides a way for us to start thinking about overcoming this polarization. We made a fictional movie a couple of years ago, and just on a very low level, it was a girl who was 16 years old, was one of the stars of the fictional movie, and she said, when I first saw this part, I don't think I could do it, because this girl is so annoying, and I've always just been so mad at annoying people. I don't see why they do it. And then, I read it, I was working on the part, and the more I worked on it, I began to realize, maybe those people who are so annoying, this is why. By living in their body, I was able to understand them better, and I've actually been much nicer to annoying people since then. So there is something about that is really authentically Brazilian. So what this means, especially now that there are lots of important Brazilian indigenous politicians, is that you're trying to understand politics in a different way. If there is, maybe the most important political philosopher of the 20th century from Europe is Carl Schmitt, who defines politics as the construction of enemies. You know who you are if you know who you hate. And if we can think about contemporary politics in the United States, it's very much that. And it's not coincidence that Hitler's favorite political philosopher was also Carl Schmitt, as is J.D. Vance's. But probably shouldn't have said that. That's just going to go anywhere. But when you compare that to one of the most important indigenous Brazilian politicians who was on the Constitutional Congress, an amazing philosopher named Ailton Krenak, who says that the goal of politics is to hold back the end of the world, which demands a collaboration. How is it that we all can come together in order to hold back the end of the world, which is something that we're all interested in, that we're all committed to. We have different ways of thinking about it, we have different interests, but we are all committed to holding back the end of the world. Okay, I'm going to try to conclude here quickly. The other thing that I think is really important for helping, that Brazil can contribute to this, is the concept that life is about making beauty together. Did an interview where somebody said, is there anything better than getting together to make something beautiful? And if you think about what is samba, the samba schools that you see walking through marching, dancing through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, it's 5,000, 10,000 people coming together for a whole year, spending more than they've got in their salaries from the favelas, making something that is extraordinarily beautiful. The music, the song, the dance, the feathers. There's something that brings you together, and that's constant in lots of different Brazilian rituals, whether it's the boi de mamão, where I'm from in Florianopolis, whether it's the bumbo meu boi, capoeira, maracatu. There's so many things. So how is it that you can understand the attempt to make beauty together? And then the samba itself, did a great interview with a samba intellectual philosopher, where he says that syncopation, that little pause that you get in jazz, that you get in samba, that you get in a lot of African music, what that syncopation is really it's an invitation. What it is it's saying, this is a moment where you can come and start your dance, where you can put your rhythm in, where you can bring in your melody, which isn't necessarily my melody. It's something new, but it's an invitation. It's saying that we can make this music together. And I really like that idea of syncopation as invitation, and it's very clear in Brazil. I have another 15 minutes to talk about our own work, but I know that conversation is the most important part here. Not just because that's the work we do, trying to inspire conversation, trying to inspire encounter, but because I've also been to a couple of these talks, and the questions are always the best part. And so I think I'm going to stop right there and talk and conclude with that idea that there's something, even though Brazil is in a moment of terrifying polarization, lots of political violence, people of the Workers' Party and people of the Liberal Party literally killing each other on the streets, that it also is a place where there is a hope for thinking new ways of encountering the other, of seeing through the eyes of the other, of inviting the other to make beauty together. So thanks.
Kurt, that was fascinating. Thank you for coming and sharing your insights on Brazil. And one of the things it does is make you compare what's happening here in the United States in terms of polarization between groups. You were talking about the original three groups that were in Brazil before slavery was eliminated, the elites and the middle group, and then the slaves themselves. And I assume Brazil is a very diverse country. You've got 2% or so indigenous people, as you said. I assume a lot of and they're primarily rural, and then you've got folks in the cities and urban areas that are a mix of people, and you talked about the elites. How would you really break down the support among the elites? I guess are very supportive of the right part of politics. Where are and what percentage are what used to be the middle people in the society? Are they supportive of are they equally divided among the right and the left in terms of rights for people?
In 2010, there was a great encounter between Obama and Lula, where Obama goes up and embraces him and says, "This is the most popular politician in the world," and which is quite true at the time. Lula had about an 80% approval rating. Today, Lula has about a 45% approval rating. He's running neck and neck with the son of Bolsonaro for the presidency this year. The real, the change in people's material lives, I don't think that there could be a better run government in Brazil than what Lula has done over the last 4 years. Unemployment is the lowest in history. Growth is good. Inflation is really low. Nonetheless, the dynamics of polarization are so hard that we're living in these different worlds, as I said. So that makes it difficult. What has happened is that you have the elite, which generally is economically opposed to Lula, even though they benefited from it. But socially, they're fine with homosexuality, gay rights. They're black people who are rich, but they want to maintain their position, and this concept of their privileges is really important. The big two groups of Bolsonaro supporters from this middle part that I was talking about are poor whites, especially in the South and in Sao Paulo, and black evangelicals. And the reason for black evangelicals is a little hard to understand. There's a great Brazilian sociologist named José de Souza, and he contends, I don't entirely agree with him, but what he says is that the way that race is constructed in Brazil is not so much whether your skin is white or black. It is a series of things around posture, calluses on your hands, how sunburned you are, whether you are working for the Europeanization of Brazil or whether you are still being African and thinking that partying is really important and that's what really matters. And so the moment that black people, again, this is his theory and I'm not entirely convinced, but it's the best one I've heard. The moment that when black people become evangelicals, they are whitening themselves. They are feeling as if they are contributing to the Europeanization or the Americanization, actually, of Brazil. And so with that, there is somebody beneath them, which are candomblé priests, gangsters, black people who have decided not to be evangelical. And so that moves them into that position of being able to humiliate somebody beneath them. Now, poor whites will often be much more cruel in their humiliations, and evangelicals, it's much more sort of passive-aggressive, that they'll be carrying Bibles around and dressing in a different way. But here's a funny story about what it means to be evangelical in Brazil. We put this into one of our fictional movies. When my wife was doing her doctorate dissertation in Recife, this was a great story, that the police had finally tracked down who was the head drug trafficker in one of the favelas where we were working. They knew who he was, they knew more or less where he was, and they just circled the favela, and there was a place where there were only a couple of entrances, and then started going house to house. And the head drug trafficker took off his Chelsea shirt, which he always wore, his baggy shorts and his cool Nike shoes. He put on a tie, a jacket, leather shoes, and he carried a Bible, and he just walked right out by the checkpoint. And so it sort of gives a sense of, if you present yourself in a certain way, you can get by. And the idea that you could be part of that alliance, of a conservative traditionalist alliance, that makes sense. I'm not answering your question very well, and I'm sorry about that, but it's hard to understand. If I think about my wife's family, it's evenly split. They've grown up in the same culture. My father-in-law is a radical left-wing anarchist. Many of his sons are radical Bolsonarists, and they just don't talk about it.
We had a question right here in the center. Actually, you mostly answered the question I had before, but I was wondering, like, how big is the middle class, like what we consider the middle class in Brazil? Or is it really mostly the elites and a lot of poor?
Right. So when I first went to Brazil in 2001, you could definitely tell that it was this sort of a curve where you got lots of elite, no, not lots of elite, an important elite, lots and lots of poor people, and then a relatively small middle class. The growth of the middle class since 98, but especially since 2002, is huge. The number of people who are acceding to that middle class. And there's lots of reasons for that happens, international economics. So like when I first went to Recife was the second most unequal city in the world after Luanda. 66% of the people lived in favelas. And a favela is an informal neighborhood. It's a place where it doesn't have formal electricity, sewage, telephone, etc. The number of people living in favelas and the transformation of favelas into lower middle class, working class neighborhoods over the last 20 years has really gone in a very good direction. I looked this statistic up for a paper a couple of years ago, and I'm going to be wrong on exactly what it is. But Brazil divides itself into 5 classes. So you've got the elite, upper middle, working class, and then favela are excluded. And I think it's like 20, 30, 20, 10, 5, something like that at this point in terms of distribution, which is more toward working class than would be the United States necessarily, but it's certainly much better than it would have been 25 years ago.
Can you please tell us about the drug culture of Brazil?
Okay, so again, in this book that we wrote in Recife, which is this very afro-Brazilian, fascinating but very unequal city in the northeast of Brazil, we discovered something really interesting, which is that the drug supplier, the original drug supplier, who would probably get the drugs shipped from Colombia or from Bolivia or from Paraguay, was somebody really rich, probably well politically connected. He would then pass the drugs to many different people in the favelas, in different favelas, who would then sell this, there would be a transfer to the drug dealers, the street drug dealers in the favelas, who would then be selling to about 60% rich white people again. So in fact, both the original producer or the original supplier and the consumers were upper middle class white people. But because the favela is sort of a free trade zone where the police don't go, that was the perfect place for sales. And that way you could just blame it all on poor black people. And so Brazil is justly known as a place that is very violent, where gangs are very important, where there's a lot of, and it's largely financed by drug trafficking. But the reason that happens isn't necessarily because poor people are selling to poor people. Yes, there are poor people who are taking drugs or poor people who are selling drugs. But in fact, it's this route that instead of just the rich white guy selling to the rich white consumer, they have to go through there because that's where the police aren't. Is that an answer to your question, or do you want more details? So originally cocaine came to Brazil as because it was a shipment point to Europe and to southern United States. As inevitably happens, it became something that was used locally as well. The marijuana continues to be very important. It's been produced in Brazil for a long time. Generally, the drug gangs will have, or at least in Rio, we didn't see this quite as much in Recife, but in Rio there's going to be the gerente do preto and the gerente do branco, with the head of white sales, cocaine sales, and the head of black sales, which is marijuana sales. And so they would be sold in different ways into different consumers. Marijuana continues to be illegal in Brazil, and the police, if you're in the favela, will make a deal out of it. When my daughter's friends and their parents smoke marijuana in middle-class lives, there's no big deal about it. I have not seen, nor have I heard from my 15-year-old daughter much about many of the drugs that are currently a big deal in the United States, fentanyl, crystal meth, things like that. It doesn't mean that it's not there, but that's not something that I've heard about.
We have our next question back here.
I was wondering about the external immigration. Does Brazil have a lot of external immigration, or are people coming in?
So Brazil is a very mobile country. We have at the moment a lot of migration from Haiti, from Bolivia, a tremendous amount from Venezuela, probably 3 to 4 million Venezuelans in Brazil now. Maybe half the Uber drivers that you're going to get a ride with are from Venezuela. One of my daughter's best friends is from Syria. A lot of migration from that part of the world because of Zaya, her friend, will insist that she's not a refugee, but it's a refugee resettlement program. In the south of Brazil, we have many Argentines who have moved, basically because Brazil is a great place to live. It's a little bit more since Milei took power. And then in terms of emigration from Brazil, there are Brazilians everywhere. I mean, it's astounding. There are a couple of cities in Minas Gerais and in the south of Santa Catarina, where if you try to go to the American embassy to get just even a tourist visa, they will just say, "Oh, you're from Criciúma? You're from Belo Monte?" No way, because Dorchester in Massachusetts is almost entirely populated by people from Criciúma in the south of Santa Catarina. Also in a lot of Europe. So I think that's pretty much the dynamic. There's both a lot of influx and outflux.
We got one up front here.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought about Bolsa Familia, because you know, I lived in Brazil and I went down there quite a few times, and it seems like when that legislation was passed, that really that's when Brazil saw its economic growth, is when that program went into effect. So the distribution of wealth in Brazil seems like it's flatlining a little bit in comparison to this country, which is equal to what Brazil was probably 20, 30 years ago. The distribution of wealth is really bad here. Yeah. Just wondering what you think of it.
Bolsa Familia is imperfect, but it is probably one of the best welfare programs in the history of the world. And the difference with Bolsa Familia is that it was a direct cash payment. It's not food stamps. It's not health benefits. It's you give the mother of a family the money that she needs to do whatever she wants. And because it was given to women, it meant that it wasn't used for alcohol. It wasn't used for gambling. It wasn't used for prostitutes. And that decision was a hugely important one. And because money is fungible, you can use it for lots of different things. What I was talking about with this small capital in the favela and the way that transformed the economy of the poor in Brazil, that happened because it's a cash transfer. Because if you got $5 extra on your food stamps at the end of the month, well, I don't know, you go out and buy some Doritos, right? But if you got $5 extra that are just $5 at the end of the month, and you keep them in your account, and then next month you have another 20, then you got something that can turn into something. And understanding, and the fact that Lula was himself a street kid. He migrated from one of the poorest areas of the Northeast to Rio and Sao Paulo. That he was a street kid, that he was a shoeshine boy, that he was a labor leader, that he really understood the economics of poverty. That's really important. Because if you're some went to Harvard, so I can say this, some Harvard economist, and you're going to say, well, those poor people, they don't know how to use their money. They don't understand and they'll come up with lots of good economic terms to say that poor people can't use their money. But if you've been poor, you understand exactly how you learn to use money, especially a mother. And so I think that's the real insight of Bolsa Familia. And I wish that other countries would have that insight as well. Where were you in Brazil? Where did you live?
Recife.
Oh, did you? So Recife is, I think Dickens, when he's talked about the best of times and the worst of times, best of cities and the worst of cities, that's Recife. It is culturally the most amazing place in the world, where any street that you walk down, there are just drums echoing, and just to see a maracatu rural with all of these men dressed as lions, and it's fabulous. And at the same time, sewage in the streets and the stench and the level of inequality and the fact that, anyway, so, yeah.
Kurt, question there. I sure appreciate your talk and your passion for Brazil. Very impressive. The question I have is, what about China? How does that get into Brazilian economics?
So there are a couple of ways, and this is something I can't talk to like as a political scientist or an economist. I'm going to talk about it as someone who just sort of pays attention to the news and who has a daughter who likes to buy fashion. So in the same way that the United States imports fashion and toys and things like that from China, Brazil does. It has more tariff limitations than the United States did until recently, which has, there are benefits and negatives of this. In terms of more the macroeconomic part, this is just an anecdote, and I can't say that it's representative of anything. But my bike mechanic had previously been a mechanic at the port of Itajaí, which is one of the important ports in the south of Brazil. And he said that, no, I'm wrong, he was in Paranaguá, which is in Curitiba, in Paraná province. So he said that he was just stunned in the 30 years that he had worked in the port when it was run by a combination of, I think it was a Brazilian, German, American company, that it was just so inefficient and corrupt and ineffective, and things just got stuck, and he didn't like it at all. Chinese bought it, and it became efficient within a year. Was very well run, effective, and my dad and I went last week to a talk at Corbell by a China scholar, and he was talking about the Belt and Roads Initiative and how the United States is often very insecure about the Belt and Roads Initiative. And what he said is that, in fact, China has this huge amount of foreign currency that it needs to get rid of. It needs to be able to have that circulate. And what China is really good at is that sort of engineering. It does roads, it does ports, it does trains really well. And I think that as China has, or as Chinese companies have bought Brazilian ports, it seems to have been a positive thing in certain ways. There is currently an effort to have a train that will go from northeastern Brazil all the way across the Amazon, then across the Andes, and get to Peru. And that's financed by also the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I am much less sanguine about that because the history of any sort of infrastructure in the Amazon is really disastrous. What happened? You start off with, you could just look at satellite photos. One road is cut through, and then within the next year, there are improvised roads that are going like this and like this and like this off of that principal road, and within 20 years, the entire forest is destroyed. And so I would be very concerned about Acre State and that part of Peru if that happens.
So you mentioned something, is that on? Oh, there, yeah. You mentioned something about technology and how advanced everybody was and didn't, in the favelas?
Favela?
Yeah.
Yep.
Are they part of that?
Oh, yeah.
And how much more advanced is the whole country than other countries?
Oh, I'm not going to say that Brazil is advanced in terms of technology. It's just that the cell phone has an immense penetration. When you go into a favela and you're hanging out with 18-year-old, 22-year-old kids who are really poor in lots of ways, don't have but they will put lots of money into making sure they've got the most recent iPhone.
Okay. And therefore, another technology question, is AI a big part of everything, or is for you, or?
So certainly AI is very important in Brazilian finance and banking. That's very clear. I think that the big difference that's going to happen is that the Brazilian economy continues to be an economy which, in spite of a certain elite finance banking system, is basically an economy dedicated to brute products, to farming, to mining, to that sort of thing. The American economy is much more of a service, white-collar economy. It's AI can replace a lawyer and a middle manager quite well. It can't necessarily replace a farmer and a combine driver and a miner in the same sort of way. So I think that there's the impact of AI on Brazil because of that is going to be different. In what way, I'm not quite sure. Where I live, Florianopolis in the south of Brazil, is the center of the Brazilian tech industry. And I think from my friends who are in tech that they are really lost, probably as lost as you and I are, about what the impact of that's going to be in Brazil. But what I really do feel is that because Brazil is an economy that's so dedicated toward basic resource extraction, that the impact will be different than it is in a service economy like the United States or Germany.
Kurt, thank you very much. Very interesting. Could I ask you to generalize about Brazilian view of the United States, particularly in light of the fact that you mentioned at the beginning, Brazil sees itself as a big, important country, leader in many, many ways. How would you generalize a view of the U.S.? Is it a roadblock in some way, or is it one avenue if they play their cards right and our politics goes in that way? Maybe we can help them get to play that role.
So I'd love to be able to generalize. I'm not particularly good at generalizing, but I think that because Brazil is such a diverse country, it's really hard to say. On the one hand, very often when I will get into a taxi, less in an Uber, but more in a taxi, and I'll say that I was born in the United States and I live in Brazil, the taxi driver will say, "What an idiot! I've spent my whole life trying to get to the United States and you're going to come live here?" And that says a lot about the American imagination economy, how Hollywood, how television, how this idea of the American dream really does filter down and colonizes the imagination of many people, thinking that this is the good life. And it is a good life, but so is Brazil. So that's one part. There's a great desire in Brazil, especially the lower middle class, to think that that immigrating to the United States would be a land of opportunity. That's changed a little bit in the last 2 years, but I'm not going to go too much into that because that'll distract us. I've already made one joke about J.D. Vance. On the other hand, when my wife told some of her best friends that she was going to be marrying me, a North American, though one who had lived in Latin America for most of his life, they almost disowned her. And I actually think that's a positive thing. That's not because there is a strand of anti-imperialism in Brazil, which is very strong. And there is a right-wing strand of that, and there is a left-wing strand of that. There's a nationalist and a sort of internationalist socialist response to American imperialism. When Trump imposed the 50% tariffs on Brazil, there was a real rally around the flag and a rally around Lula. His popularity rating jumped 10% in a week. So that there is an understanding of the danger that the United States implies. At the same time, there's that evangelical thing that I was talking about, which is sort of we are participating in the Americanization, the modernization of Brazil. So it's a really ambiguous thing, and in some cases you will find the same person with two opposite opinions 2 days in 2 different days, and that's just how. Yeah.
Yes, I know that you've worked in the favelas and wonder what the status of children and their future holds for those people in the favelas or elsewhere in the country.
So about a decade ago, one of the things that we do in addition to research is that we make movies. And a movie that we made was an encounter between, that we taught kids from the favelas how to make fictional movies, and we taught kids from the upper middle class how to make fictional movies. Each group made a movie imagining what life would be like for the other, interpreting them, so forth. And then each showed the movie to the other, and then they got together and played for a couple of days, first in the favela and then in the upper middle class. And it was really an awesome thing. The movie was shown, I don't even know how many times on Brazilian public TV. It made a real impact in the country. Now, maybe the most impactful thing that happened to me during that movie was that Rita, my wife, was interviewing a boy named João, 10 or 11 years old at the time. And João had a perfect life. If you're imagining, if you're a Brazilian parent and you want your kid to have a good life, he had it. He had a wonderful room that was full of toys. His parents loved him. He had a great school. He was learning his critical thinking skills. His parents took him to Europe. They had a house in the countryside. And it was really a good life. And what he said during the interview is this. He said, you know what I've learned during this process? I've learned that we should all have equal rights. I thought, okay, good. Human rights, that's a good lesson. And then he said what really hit me. He said, I don't see why kids from the favela should be able to play on the street and I can't. So he who had this perfect life understood that what he was missing was freedom and company and that joy of playing on the street that probably most of you had when you were kids, and I certainly did, and was wonderful. And this sense of loss. And since then, in so many different movies, we've found the same thing of kids missing the street, of missing freedom, of missing encounter with nature and missing encounter with friends. And so I know this isn't exactly the answer to your question, Adrian, but what it means to me is that it's not just a question of what are the lives looking like for kids in the favelas. They have much more access to the opportunity of university than they did 20 years ago. Much more opportunity much less hunger than they had 20 years ago. But I think that the biggest question that I'm dealing with these days is how do we create a different kind of city where all kids can play together on the street, where they can all dream together about some sort of different world, and where they can all imagine that they might go to college, or they might become farmers, or they might raise goats, or they might become whatever. I mean, that's the question. How is it that you create a world in which kids can be truly free? And I think that there are certain ways where we're moving in a good direction on that, Brazilian university policy, for instance, and there are ways where it's becoming a disaster, which are the walls that we're building around ourselves, these cell phones that kids spend so much time on, and all this time that we spend indoors instead of playing together outside. By the way, as another movie that we made in Brasilia, we asked a kid, so what would you like to say to all the adults who are watching this movie? And normally we just ask the question and the kids don't say anything interesting, but this kid, Jude Nilsson, said, okay, I want to say this to all parents. Okay, first of all, let your kids play outside. Secondly, you go outside and play with them because you deserve to play too. And Jude Nilsson, you're right. Yeah, that's the question. It's how do we create a city in which we can all play outside again?
Okay, one over here. 2 questions. What about abortion in Brazil? And what about the next election? When is it? And do you have mail-in ballots?
So, abortion, I would say abortion is very much like marijuana. If you are of the upper middle class and you know where to go, it is available, and you're not going to be penalized for it, but it's illegal. If you are poor and you don't know where to go and you try to do it by yourself and you go to a hospital because you're bleeding, you're in really bad trouble. Brazil continues, in spite of many of the things that I've talked about, to have a very conservative attitude around sexual politics, which is sort of strange given that in other ways Brazil is very liberal around sexual politics. It's more welcoming to gays than any place else in Latin America and things like that. But abortion, Brazil is really backwards. Voting in Brazil. Voting in Brazil is done on electronic machines. You go to a polling place, you are required to vote. You go to a polling place and each candidate will have a number. So both a presidential candidate will have a 1 or 2 digit number, a very down ballot candidate will probably have a 5-digit number. And you will then put that into the machine and then you'll leave. The benefit of that is that on the night of the election, you know who won within an hour, and that's super positive. There is no, when you are traveling, there is no mail-in ballot. If you are, Hito was out of the country, for instance, once during an election, and she had to go to the electoral judge and show with her plane tickets that she'd been out of the country, or she would have been fined and would have lost her passport, because you have to vote. Yes, I don't remember. I have to ask. I don't know. I don't vote in Brazil, and so I don't know. I think that you have to show identification, but I'm not sure about that.
Is that on? Thank you for just a terrific exposition of the whole country and its attitudes. I had a question about the indigenous people, particularly are they interested in and are they able to maintain their culture, kind of like the Maoris in New Zealand?
So again, immensely diverse country. There are 305 different indigenous groups in Brazil. In the area where we have worked most, in the upper Rio Negro, in an area, in one town, it's a big town, physically a big town, though there aren't that many people. There are 28 ethnic groups speaking 22 different languages. So that said, I can't generalize. This is the thing that I'm telling you. Generalization is really hard. There is a really strong and wonderful indigenous movement right now in Brazil, which is taking pride in being indigenous. And for instance, I was thinking as I was preparing this talk about the difference between somebody like Ben Nighthorse Campbell or Bill Richardson, both Native Americans who served in, I think both are senators. Bill Richardson was also governor of New Mexico. But if you think of the way that they presented themselves, Bill Nighthorse Campbell had the bolo tie, but he didn't wear a headdress on the floor of the Senate. Sile Chacriabá, Sonia Guajajara, they do, and very proudly and insistently. When they are going to give a speech on the floor of the House, they paint themselves in traditional ways. They are going to be wearing the headdress, and the movement to elect, especially women, indigenous women, to Congress is called the headdress movement, Bancada do Cocar, because it's insisting that it's not just being indigenous and being there, but you have to, and being in Congress, or not being just indigenous and powerful, but that you have to really insist on who you are, and mark that as something that you're proud of. Now, that said, it's really important to understand that because of this logic that I was telling you about of always wanting to see the perspective of the other, indigenous people in Brazil have always been changing. They're constantly because they're learning from the people on the other side of the river, from the people up the river, down the river, they're always in transformation. They don't have the teleological one direction of European concepts of history that you're going to someplace, but they're always changing. There's always transformation. And so one of the most insulting things that you can say to an indigenous person in Brazil is, what, you're indigenous, you got a truck? You're indigenous, you got a cell phone? The expectation that if you are indigenous, you have to be naked and wear your paint and your headdress, tremendously offensive, because they are always changing. They're wanting to adopt new ways, things that'll work. There was a movement, an artistic movement in the early 20th century called the anthropophagists, the cannibals, who insisted that what cannibalism really is cannibalism is ingesting the culture of the other and making it yours. It's not ingesting the meat of the other, it's ingesting the culture of the other and making it yours. And that's the way that most indigenous people would think about the cell phone or the internet. Yeah, we have a right to it, we're gonna use it, we're gonna do great things with it, but don't say that we're not indigenous because we don't use it anymore. One of the things that Bolsonaro would say is, oh, what, they're not indigenous anymore, they got cell phones. And that was considered to be just like, he lost every indigenous vote in the country with that.
Thank you for such a rich and colorful perspective. Can you please comment on what you see as the possibilities in the future of the environmental interests and the conservation and ecology?
So I have, to this point, presented a very positive view of the Workers' Party government, and I continue to have that in general terms. The one real weakness is on environmental issues. There is a very developmentalist perspective within many parts of the Workers' Party, not in the same way of we're going to transform everything into to pasture that's a traditional colonialist view in Brazil, but yes, we need dams, so that's been a real challenge. The current environmental minister for the country is great. She was she was mentored by Chico Mendes, who was a very important environmentalist in Brazil in the 1980s, killed by ranchers and loggers. It's a point of constant tension, especially because right now both the Senate and the House are controlled by agricultural interests. Agricultural interests by ranching and farming interests who really think it's important to cut down the forest because it's more money for them. On the other hand, it's very clear, and I think even those ranching and farming interests understand that the Amazon is important not because it provides water. I mean, the Amazon the way that weather patterns work in Brazil is that the trees transpirate, and then the water that comes out of the trees in the Amazon flows south, and that's what provides all of the rain for the farming parts of Brazil in Sao Paulo and Mato Grosso and Goiás. And so I think that that's coming to be understood at least a little bit more in some places. So that's the negative or the ambiguous part right now. If the right wins in the next presidential election, all bets are off. I mean, it could be really, really bad. On the other hand, in the south of Brazil, the Mata Atlântica, there used to be two major rainforests in Brazil, the Amazon, which everybody knows about, and an equally big jungle, which was along the Atlantic coast. It's called the Mata Atlântica. And as colonization happened, that was just destroyed, starting in the 16th century, and continuing on until the 20th. But over the last 10 or 15 years, for the first time in history, and I think this is the only ecosystem in the world doing this, but the Mata Atlântica is recovering. It's growing. It's only 12% of what it was at the moment of colonization, but it is now coming back and growing, and that's a really positive thing. Also, it's the ecosystem that I live in, and so it makes me feel good.
Well, since, excuse me, since we're comparing the United States or Brazil to the United States, I am curious to know how the Brazilian wages are taxed. Here in the United States, we have Social Security. I just read recently with very disturbing news about AI displacing workers, which is going to affect our Social Security, which may collapse by 2033. But with AI replacing workers, we're looking at probably our Social Security collapsing in a couple of years. So how are the Brazilians supported with welfare, with this money that's given to the mother, the woman of the family? I'm just real curious.
Sure. Yeah, the issue with any economic crisis in the United States, and the problem with I don't think that many people are talking about immigration as well, but the immigrants, illegal, undocumented immigrants in the United States also paid into Social Security that was providing support for Social Security, and it's not there anymore, let alone what's thinking about AI. So in Brazil, recently, anyone who earns up to 5,000 reais a month, which is lower middle class, lower middle class, making maybe $40,000 a year here, does not pay any taxes at all. That their taxes were completely cut. They do continue to pay into Social Security. When you pay Social Security, you pay at a certain percentage of the minimum wage. And so if you pay 11 minimum wages in your Social Security, as you're not actually paying 11 minimum wages per month. What you're paying is the rate of somebody. Man, this is just too complicated to explain. In fact, I won't even go into that. So Social Security in Brazil is run like Social Security in the United States, in the sense that it is a fee on contemporary workers to support past workers. And so if there is a crisis in contemporary workers and contemporary labor market, then the people who would be getting the Social Security will lose out on that. I mean, that's why what you're talking about is an issue, because it's not that your Social Security is put in a savings account that is, or not yours, but Social Security is not put in a savings account that you then get when you're 65 years old. It is, Social Security is paid by the current workers to the people who had worked in the past. So that's why contemporary economic crises are bad on Social Security. And the same thing goes on in Brazil. The money that I pay into Social Security is paying my father-in-law's Social Security. And when I retire, it'll be my daughter or many other people of her generation who are paying mine. The taxation in Brazil, I confess, is something that confuses me a lot. If somebody had my salary, which isn't a whole lot, it's like $24,000 a year, which in the United States sounds like poverty, but in Brazil it's a nice salary. If I were a salaried employee of a company, about 30 to 50% of that would be gone in taxes, Social Security, other fees. But because I am a business owner, it's a nonprofit business owner, but because I'm a business owner, I don't pay any tax almost at all. I pay 3% tax. And so one of the very strange things that's happened recently in Brazil is that many people are incorporating themselves as businesses. And instead of being hired by your company as a salaried employee, you hire yourself as a business, as a outsourced business. And that way you pay a 3 to 6% tax instead of a 30 to a 50% tax. What this means for the federal treasury, I don't know, because it's a big, big change. It's been really good for small business construction because now there are so many small businesses that then grow and hire other people and so forth. But in terms of tax structure, it's very strange.
When you talked about the causes of polarization, there seem to be several parallels, again, between Brazil and the United States. But what is the solution? How will Brazil get out of this spiral of polarization?
You know, I'd like to think that some of the things that I talked about at the end have the opportunity to make it change. I hope. I'm not sure about that. I don't know how the United States is going to get out of this spiral of polarization either. I think that so much of it, in spite of the fact that, yes, it emerges from a history of colonization, it emerges from slavery, humiliation, all these things that I've talked about, I think that the thing that I least touched on, if we don't address that problem, which is social media, which is the internet, then we're not going to get anywhere. Because that's what's making us live in different worlds. I mean, the different worlds were constructed by by slavery and colonization. That's true in the United States as well as in Brazil. And I've been reading a book by Ta-Nehisi Coates as I've been here, and it's been fascinating to see the way that he describes slavery in the South, and it's very, very similar to what I'm talking about in Brazil. He talks, I actually wrote down this quote where he says, about so he describes the quality, which is what I've called the elite, the low, which is what I've called these middle groups, and then the task, or the enslaved. And Ta-Nehisi quote says, they, the low, were a degraded and downtrodden nation, enduring the boot of the quality solely for the right to put their own boot on the tasked. And so that dynamic exists in the United States and exists in Brazil. But I think that what makes that not just sort of an inchoate oppression, but really into this polarization where we can't even talk to each other, is this world of social media where we've been so divided into this is what you see on your Instagram feed. And then the news that you're going to see on your Instagram feed is what's going to make you keep flipping and flipping and flipping. And what she's going to see on her Instagram feed is what keeps her flipping and flipping and flipping. And what my Bolsonarista brother-in-law sees is just more things that are going to make him mad. And what my anarchist father-in-law sees is just what's going to make him mad. And then my brother-in-law and his father talk less and less and less. And so I think unless we mess with the algorithms, unless we start to think about the way in which we know the world, and we're knowing more and more of the world through this thing and not through our own eyes and not through our conversations with real people, and until we start inhabiting the same world again, it's going to be really hard to get over this polarization in Brazil, in the United States, any place.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.